Barely 10 days ahead of the budget, noises around big expenditure cuts are growing as the finance minister goes on an austerity drive to rein in the fisc and avoid a ratings downgrade. But are deep cuts an answer to India's macroeconomic puzzle at a time when consumption is faltering, private investment is extremely weak and inflation is soaring? Moreover, even if it makes good economic sense in a pre-election year, is this bad politics? That's our debate tonight on We Mean Business, and joining us is a power-packed panel. Dr. D.K. Joshi, Chief Economist at Crisil, joins in on a link from Mumbai. In our New Delhi studios, we have Nalin Kohli, a National Executive Member of the BJP, Shoma Chaudhary, Managing Editor of Tehelka, and Ashok Kumar Jha, former Finance Secretary. Also joining in on a link from the capital, we have Dr. Didar Singh, the Secretary General of FICCI, and Mr. C.M. Vasudev, former Secretary of Finance, Expenditure and Economic Affairs. I want to begin with Dr. Joshi. In fact, sir, reports suggesting that this is likely to be one of the most austere budgets in recent history. Is this thinking justified?
Well, I think at this juncture, if you want to maintain fiscal deficit at 4.8% of GDP, which Finance Minister has been talking about, I think there's no other option but the expenditure reform, because in a slowing economy, the kick from revenues will be missing. I think if I take you back to the previous era of fiscal consolidation when Mr. Chidambaram was the finance minister, at that juncture during 2003-4 to 2007-8, I think we managed to bring the fiscal deficits down below the FRBM target, primarily because there was a huge revenue kick from growth. The corporate profits were high, the indirect tax collections were also very high. So I think this time around, and we did no expenditure reforms at that juncture, and the correction was purely on the basis of revenue, and that was not sustainable, and that's what we are seeing right now. That today I think the revenue position is not going to be good even next year because nobody is expecting a very swift turnaround. So in that situation, if government cuts expenditure, it will have some negative impact on growth. But if you don't cut expenditure, I think the impact will be much worse, because you will not be reining in the fiscal deficit, which needs to be reined in. So what government probably needs to do is that while they focus on expenditure rationalization and move their expenditure from the subsidy side to the capital expenditure side, that is what they need to show in the budget. And apart from that, I think overall growth scenario, private investment scenario is not essentially down because of government not spending. I think it's down because of variety of other factors. Right. So simultaneously, you need to lift the private sentiment also by taking positive action on various spending reforms.
Right. You know, we're talking about all of this, of course, in a day when the government, it seems, has cancelled the last tranche of its borrowings of about 12,000 crore rupees. But Mr. Didar Singh, how prudent do you really think it is to cut costs at a time when the economy is literally down and out? We're talking about growth projections of below 5%. Private investment, of course, is extremely weak. Consumer demand is faltering. Isn't all of this going to exacerbate the slowdown?
I don't think so. You know, you put the title, in fact, of this discussion today to be big expenditure cuts coming. Is it good economics but bad politics? First of all, I don't think it's bad politics. I think it's good politics. So far as industry is concerned, so far as FICCI is concerned, you know, we have been making a point all along that the only way to get investment going again, to improve the climate which members are facing, the only way is really to bring interest rates down. And bringing interest rates down, I think RBI has been very, very clear over the past few months that unless the fiscal deficit is reined in, the question of bringing interest rates down doesn't come up. Now, this has a tremendous impact on the overall investment climate, on manufacturing, and then the whole growth scenario. So it's a chicken and egg situation. Where do you start? The point is that the Kelkar committee had also said this, that unless you're able to rein this in, unless you're able to do reforms, whether it's in the form of the diesel prices and what have you, unless that begins to happen, you're not going to be able to bring that growth climate back again. And therefore, we believe that this is definitely in the right step. And if it is really expenditure cuts coming, we welcome them as an industry association. This falls in line with what we've been saying all along, and we hope that this does actually happen.
Right, Shoma, so the industry, of course, is saying this is a good thing for them. It bodes well for the government's bid to sort of contain its fiscal targets at 5.3. But is the big worry really going to be the impact of all of this on the Aam Aadmi? Because social sector schemes are going to be also taking a cut from what we've been reading. At a time when the Aam Aadmi is battling sort of huge amounts of inflation, further cuts in terms of government help is clearly going to be a big worry.
Yes, actually, I'm amazed to hear, FICCI saying that they are very pleased if there's going to be expenditure cut, that there will be, cuts in welfare spending, because I don't think that's just bad politics, contrary to him saying it's good politics. I think it's bad economics, The fact that consumption has gone down, the fact that so far one has assumed that only if the top percentage makes profits, that, the growth will continue as one envisions it to grow, is clearly come a cropper, Unless people are pulled into the economy, unless they're given a basic platform of human dignity where they can at least be entrepreneurs, your consumer base is going to fall flat. We keep talking about demographic dividends, but we don't want to invest in that demographic dividend. And so what you really have is a creamy layer that has been making a lot of money. And so there are certain global reasons why, that kind of momentum has been lost. There have been policy decisions that have been reversed. So a kind of sentiment has been spoiled. But to keep on harping about, fiscal deficit as being connected with welfare spending, I think is a patently bad argument, because when you look at the maths of it, the amount of money that is being spent on welfare is a very small amount. It is barely 2 or 3% of the budget and of the GDP. And that really is making the country robust. Right. And equally, what I must say is very heartening is that, barely 2 days ago, Tehelka held a roundtable conference. Is going to be part of our cover story, this issue, where we had people like Tarun Das, Sunil Munjal, Subodh Bhargav, people who've also been part of CII, high captains of industry, who categorically said that they are completely pro-welfare spending. They think that it has been an important part of the growth story of India. They're worried about the implementation and the leakages and the governance issues, but they certainly don't think that welfare spending should stop in India, and I think it's short-sightedness.
Right. Mrs. Singh, I just want you to respond to Shoma, and also then should welfare spending and plan expenditure remain out of this? Maybe you can think...
I want to just respond. Let me make one thing clear. I think he's got it wrong. At no point did we say or I say that welfare spending should be stopped. We are talking about fiscal deficit here, and fiscal deficit is, we know, largely because of government spending on itself, frankly, and the whole issue of actually containing it would really mean that we are able to release funds for the right places. We have to get in growth on the one hand and release funding for welfare schemes which are required, and we totally support completely the question of the direct transfer scheme that has been talked about, which will bring efficiencies in the whole system of disbursement of welfare in whatever form it is done. We support the development related activities which really are the ones that lead to inclusive growth, and here we are talking about funding, or we are talking about government expenditure on places where you can actually reduce it, and on places where you can make it more efficient, more effective, and lead actually to real growth in the economy. And the link that we are making is between fiscal deficit and interest rates, because that is the question of investment in the economy in a total aspect. And we do know that the rule of thumb at a global level is 3%, and we've gone to somewhere about 5.7%. If this just goes on, I mean, what are we trying to do? Do we want a situation where we have an economic crisis which is completely across the whole economy? So we support government's idea of trying to contain the fiscal deficit, because unless you do that, we are not going to be getting back on the growth path.
Mr. Vasudev, would you respond to that? And Didar Singh mentioned, areas where the government can cut back wasteful expenditure. What are some of those areas? Because what we've been learning is that ministries are likely to get a 20 to 30% cut, and that would help in terms of, that would sort of affect project funding, that would affect schemes like Narega and JNN and URM as well.
I think when you're talking about expenditure cuts, I suppose you're not talking about a sledgehammer type of across the board expenditure cuts, which is certainly not possible in our system, neither is it desirable. After all, the composition of our expenditure is extremely rigid. There are areas like salaries and pensions and interest payments and defense and security expenses, expenses on running the organs of the state. These are all very rigid type of expenditures, and there is hardly any cut that is feasible in that. What I suppose one is really talking about is a cut in non-productive expenditure and freeing resources of the government also for making investments. So what are we talking about? We are really talking about non-productive expenditures on areas like subsidies, better directing subsidies to people who really need it, subsidies on petroleum products, subsidies on fertilizer, and there are a host of other subsidies in the government system which are non-productive, not contributing to the growth process at all. Of course, there are certain elements of subsidy which are part of the welfare system which should continue. I don't think there is anything going to be gained by cutting those type of expenses which in any case don't amount to very much. So one aspect is how to cut non-productive expenditure, how to reduce subsidies, free government expenditure for directing it towards investment. The second aspect, I think, which Mr. Didar Singh I think very rightly alluded to, is that if this also helps in reducing the fiscal deficit, I think it will improve the flexibility available with the monetary authority, that is the Reserve Bank of India, to loosen the monetary policy a little bit, put more liquidity into the system, reduce interest rates, which is going to spur more private investment. So it is a combination of these measures that one is really, I think, talking about, which will help in stimulating growth without in any way curbing the fiscal consolidation process that the government is intending to do. Having said this, I just want to allude to one aspect which is, for some reason I'm surprised, is not being talked about too much. We are talking about reducing the say petroleum subsidies. Now we've got a system of import duties on petrol and diesel, 1% or thereabout. There is no import at all taking place of diesel or petrol, and we are running an import parity type of a regime for fixing the prices of the petroleum products of the oil companies. If the government were to abolish these duties, which are going to have no practical impact at all on the revenues of the government, I think the under recoveries themselves will come down, and that will free up fiscal space. I suppose that is an area which needs to be looked at, so that you can achieve this objective, reducing the subsidy without in any way affecting the fiscal mathematics.
Right, Mr. Jap, Mr. Vasudev spoke about reducing subsidies. How critical is it that the government does it, and should the government do it at a time when you've already had partial deregulation of diesel? We're talking about sugar prices being decontrolled. It's the Aam Aadmi at the end of the day who's going to be bearing high inflationary costs, and so a cut down in subsidy may not hurt industry but would hugely hurt those at the bottom of the pyramid.
No, I think firstly I think we are all shooting in the dark. See, it is reduction in expenditure does not necessarily imply that we are going to curtail welfare expenditure. The second point here is that how long can we keep on spending more than we have? See, fiscal deficit is really a reflection of the fact that we are living way beyond our means. So it has to be curtailed. Now, as far as subsidies are concerned, see, the total subsidies in the current budget is about 1.9 lakh crores, of which about 1.8 lakh crores is the subsidies on account of food, fuel and fertilizers. Now this, some people believe that these estimates are gross underestimates, and actually the figure should and would probably be greater when the actual expenditure comes about. Now, quite obviously, if we are able to target these subsidies properly without doing away with these subsidies, particularly that of food and even fertilizers, one can do a fair amount of saving. In fact, one of the studies shows that we can save as much as 40% of these subsidies if they are properly targeted. So, if the scheme that the government has come out with, the direct benefit transfer scheme, if that is implemented properly, and if it is properly sort of the structures on ground are put in place, then 40% of 1.8 lakh crores is quite a bit of money. And as far as the reduction in in the budget is concerned, it is done every year. Every year the finance ministry in January takes stock of the situation.
Right.
All departments that are spending or have spent less than a certain threshold are told that they will not get the full 100% of the budget, because quite obviously they have problems in spending.
Right.
And therefore the budget is frozen at by 5%, 10%, sometimes even by 20%. So therefore this alarm that is being created that there is going to be a huge cut in the budget and all, I fail to understand the reason behind this alarm.
Right, but the sense we're getting is that there's going to be at least a $20 billion cut. At least that's what's been reported in various agencies. But Nalin Kohli, so everybody seems to agree that at this point in time, in order to contain the fiscal deficit, yes, probably we need to tighten our belts. Is that, everybody seems to agree that it's good economics, but is this bad politics?
Nikhil, I'd like to look at the big picture and then start getting down to specifics. Let's face the fact. The economy is certainly facing a difficult situation. Now, one political discussion could be why are we in this situation, but let's keep out of it and focus on the issue here. Now, we are in a situation where fiscal deficit is about 6%. It has jumped in that period of 2008, 9, 10. We also have a situation where the revenue deficit has gone up from approximately, if I remember, 1.1 to 4.5%, again in the same period of 2008, 2009, 10. Now, there are two ways of looking at it. One way would be that say, okay, internationally the economies were floundering, so therefore this was to boost the economy. Another way that could be interpreted is that a lot of popular schemes did come up, keeping in mind that there was an election year around the corner. But certainly we are in a difficult situation. Now, link that further with food inflation, and let's keep it targeted to the common man. Food inflation is very high. It's been consistently over 10% for almost 77, 78 months in the tenure of the UPA. Now, when you start removing, for example, subsidies or reducing subsidies on diesel, you are impacting price rise at the cutting edge, which is, say, food, movement of goods, movement of food commodities, etc., etc. So therefore, in a situation like this, where we are, you have to bring about a balance. A government, irrespective who runs the government, which political party is heading it, has to look at industry, has to look at business, at the same time has to look at its social responsibilities. So therefore, you have to fine tune it, and that's the creative exercise that you would expect from a finance minister and his team. So here we are in this situation. What could be done? The first thing is, instead of immediately talking about cuts, can we look at efficiencies? For example, when projects are bottlenecked or projects are not taking place on time, you are essentially raising costs. And as you are raising costs, you are increasing your expenditure. And that's, anything, there are examples of, say, mega projects like, say, the Mumbai Sea Link. From a 3 to 4,000 crore project, it finally closed at 17,000-18,000 crores, if I recall correctly. Now, this is a price that finally the country is paying. Second is decision taking. If that's not happening on time, you're locking up assets, you're locking up capital, you're basically creating a cost on the project itself. Let's look at it from industry's perspective. Manufacturing is suffering in the country. Now that's an important base.
A lot of that's already happening, I think through the CCI, which is now. Yeah, Nikhil, go ahead.
Let me just finish on this. I have a couple of points only to flag. I've been hearing the whole discussion. What I was saying, from a manufacturing perspective, certainly they've got concerns, the manufacturing sector. You're down to almost close to a negative growth. In some sectors, it's grossly negative. Now you have bottlenecks related to manufacturing. Interest burden has increased. So therefore, they have every right to be worried, because it leads to loss of jobs in the manufacturing sector. If you're not, infrastructure projects are slow. So the announcements are not important at this part. What is important is action on the ground. So if you remove inefficiencies even in the system of subsidies, targeted subsidies reaching the poor, you are basically helping the economy go further. And one last example is that of the farmers' suicides and the farm package of 60,000 crores. Now we are getting reports that it didn't reach the targeted sections, it was becoming a scam. So if the government focuses on efficiencies, a lot of its problems will be there. there might be some areas it may have to consider tightening its belt.
Right, and I think the finance minister, of course, has a very tight window. So probably the easiest answer at this point in time would be to cut spends. But Shoma, how politically palatable is that going to be? Because we've already heard noises from ministries, disgruntled ministries saying, they're not really open to these kind of cuts. Is the UPA in some sense in a bit of a bind in that sense?
You know, Nikhil, I mean, I'm not a trained business journalist, so you'll have to forgive me if I don't use the correct vocabulary for this. But I'm really not very interested in what the ministries feel. I'm really much more interested in the kind of discussion we have in the media, because it is in many ways opinion making. And I still think that the conversation is very blinkered and it is very, very one-sided. Because, one constantly speaks of the Aam Aadmi as a burden, one speaks of the kind of expenditures on them as, I'm glad that everyone's agreed that welfare spending is good, because the point I'm making is that, a lot of subsidies are given to industry as well. But when we focus only on manufacturing and industry in an economy as complex as India, we already are kind of closeting ourselves in a very, very small space. What we are not discussing on this show, for instance, is that reports have come out that these years of frenetic growth has actually seen jobless growth, if not negative jobs. There are a huge number, millions of people who are being forced to get off their land, their livelihoods, because our economic planning is so monodimensional. I think right now the discussion in the media should be about how to make our economic planning much more multi-pronged, to accept that almost 90% of India lives outside the formal economy, lives outside the purview of this very discussion. So, when you're talking about so many 600-700 million people that are not part of the formal economy, I think that we're really talking just amongst ourselves. Yes, there's concern about manufacturing and industry having gone down, incentives having gone down. But when you're talking about decision making, I see the problem in a completely different way. I think that the reason why there is so many stalled projects right now is that the conceptual planning was completely wrong. The laws on which projects were passed was wrong. Nikhil, may I just finish making this point? Yeah. I commiserate with industry and with all big projects where they are stopped, because I think they do need a lot of clarity on what the landscape is going to be. But the reason these things are stopped is there is resistance from ground. And there is resistance from ground because the planning was bad. The SEZ Act was bad, the Land Acquisition Act was bad, there's no relief and rehabilitation plans, there's no environmental sort of protection. And so people, of course, resisted because they can't see how they're going to benefit from it. Right. So if government is going to have clarity, they need to think for public good, and that would be to the betterment of industry, because I agree there is a cost on projects when they are stalled. But they're stalled because the planning is bad. The decision making in the beginning was bad.
Right. I just want to take that to Didar Singh. Didar Singh, the industry is sort of clamoring for a cut in subsidies. Why shouldn't the finance minister then balance it out on with a tax on the super rich, or with a cut in subsidies for industry? Shoma is making a very valid point there.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I do agree that, one has to look at the larger picture, and I'm sure government and I'm sure the finance minister is going to look at the larger picture. But let me just make 2 points here. One, you're talking about this issue of higher taxation for high net individuals. Our point has always been that, you have a stable tax regime that you try to bring in over the last 10 to 15 years, and you don't want to disturb that, because this has been proven time and time again across the world, that the moment you try and tinker with a stable regime and try and go on taxing the same people again and again, it's time that you begin to look outside that little base that you have. But on the more larger point of the stated government policy of inclusive growth, remember, inclusive growth, and that includes welfare, happens when you have growth. So if you don't have growth, where do you talk about the inclusive aspect of it? And I totally agree with other comments which have been made here, that Mr. Jha made it, and so did Mr. Vasudev, that you have to look at efficiencies both in the tax administration to improve the amount of revenues that government get, and you have to look at efficiencies which is actually being looked at in the direct cash transfer scheme. And just to continue with what Mr. Jha was raising, not only are there studies showing that there is some 40% of loss in the food grain market, on food grain distribution, because of various leakages within it. There is another almost 40% in the subsidy on kerosene, which is again lost, and we have a report which was done by Mr. Ashok Gulati, Dr. Ashok Gulati, which suggests that fertilizer subsidy can be pruned by almost 60,000 crores by 2013-14 if you move towards the direct cash transfer scheme. Now, all of this basically releases more money into the welfare system.
Absolutely. So nobody is disputing that
because you're not being able to bring in efficiencies, therefore raise more taxes.
So absolutely, nobody is disputing that efficiencies need to be brought in, and probably the super rich tax is a bit of a contentious matter. But would industry be open to some rollbacks, some sort of drawbacks on certain SOPs and incentives that industry is getting? Because if the if the Aam Aadmi can take cuts, so can the industry.
The greatest rollback I think we can have is, and if you roll in, is if you bring in GST. You bring in GST and you see the amount of benefit that the overall GDP will have. So those larger picture items, if you're able to do for the country, I mean, surely we will get growth.
Right. Mr. Joshi, please, take that forward. Shouldn't the focus then be on issues like GST and reform on the revenue side rather than on the expenditure side? Because nothing seems to be happening on the revenue side.
Well, I agree. I mean, but GST is not going to yield results very quickly. I mean, so I think its implementation is also, it needs to be fast-tracked, and I think it's the most fundamental reform in the indirect taxation that will happen. I think it has many spillover benefits, and estimates show that if you actually put in place GST in a fine manner, then the GDP of the country can go up by something like 0.9% to 1.5%, in that range. But I just wanted to come back to the question of manufacturing. I think when we talk of inclusive growth, I don't think in this country you can have inclusive growth without promoting the manufacturing sector or industrial sector, because the people who are going to come out of agriculture, where will they find employment? And currently, I think the way things are, the manufacturing sector itself is not growing, and in the past when it has grown, I think it has grown through capital intensive means. I mean, it is not labor intensive. Reason for that is the labor laws and other enabling legislation. So I think if you really want to make growth sustainable and inclusive, there's no way without increasing the size of manufacturing sector. So I think removing the bottlenecks for manufacturing is going to be a very critical factor for promoting inclusive growth in this country. You cannot depend on Narega. I agree. I think there's a growing gap between the poor and rich in this country. The inequality through Gini coefficient shows an increase. So there is need to lift the poor. But I think depends on how you want to do it. I mean, do you want to give them fish to eat, or do you want to teach them how to fish? So I think the larger issue would be to skill the rural population, to educate them, to make them participate in the growth process and not become dependent on support from the government. In the short run, you do require support through these welfare schemes, but eventually I think there has to be a bigger picture where industrial and manufacturing sector becomes a source for sustainable growth and employment.
Shoma, you want to come in very quickly because I have to go to the other panel.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a couple of quick points. You know, when you say that that growth cannot happen without manufacturing, I'd just like to reiterate that at no point is one making an argument that one should not have industry or manufacturing. The simple point I'm making is that there needs to be a more multi-pronged approach and dialogue, not just in the ministry, in the political circuit, but even in the media landscape, in discussions about Indian economy. It needs to be more multi-pronged. And again, I would really like to make the point here that when you're speaking about the rest of India, which is not in the formal sector of industry and manufacturing, you know, one keeps saying that they should not depend on support of government. Industry and manufacturing is always asking for support of government. And in fact, to the contrary, sir, the point I'd like to make is that India is made up of a billion kind of, you know, entrepreneurships that can be very sustainable, that can actually add to Indian economy. Small and medium enterprises, crafts, traditional livelihoods, all of which is being destroyed because we do not give dignity or value to it. But let me give you a small number. Just the craft industry across the world is worth $400 billion. India has only 2% of that. And we are driving people away from those livelihoods into just the idea that only industry and manufacturing can provide jobs. And as you yourself said, most of the manufacturing and growth in recent years has been very mechanized based, and it is not labor intensive. So, you know, I just feel that there is a kind of monolithic approach to one's planning. This is not to say that industry and manufacturing should not be robust or should not flower in this country, but just that why do we only speak of it as being the one-way route to prosperity? There has to be a multi-pronged approach, and not only one that is based on chivalric, welfare spending, what we call welfare spending.
Mr. Vasudev, I just want to come to the sort of larger philosophical academic question on this entire thing of cutting spending. There are a lot of them who say that we're probably going down the path that Europe did of austerity when we should be expanding the fisc and actually spending our way out of the slowdown. We've all spoken about manufacturing and what needs to be done. Now, one of the sort of fears is that, a further reduction in government spending and capital expenditure could actually derail the manufacturing story further.
Certainly the composition of government expenditure is extremely important. But when you are running a system where the total borrowing by the government, that is the fiscal deficit, is almost equal to your expenditure on subsidies, then you are really borrowing money for non-productive expenditure, which is something which cannot continue, which is not sustainable. And I think the focus really is not, I hope it is not on across the board cut in spending. The focus is on selective cuts, non-productive areas, so that more and more resources can be released for investment purposes, productive expenditure. Right. And on the issue of the subsidies, I think the hallmark, it is recognized, I think, in many reports that the hallmark of a good subsidy regime is that it should be transparent, and it should be efficient, and it should be well directed. Unfortunately, our subsidy regimes in the case of major subsidies do not stand the test on any of these three grounds. Right. We do not know when we are giving subsidies on petroleum products whether we are subsidizing the consumer or we are subsidizing inefficiencies, because it is a cost plus pricing regime. In the case of fertilizer subsidies, we do not know whether we are subsidizing the farmer or we are subsidizing the producer. Here again it is a cost plus pricing regime. Take the case of food subsidy. We do not know whether we are really subsidizing the entire amount to the consumer of the food grains or we are subsidizing the inefficiencies of the Food Corporation of India.
Right. Hopefully,
so
of course, the cash,
I think
hopefully the cash transfers sort of system that the government has put in place would address some of those issues. Sir, we have to take a quick break. We have to take
that remains to be tested.
Yeah.
Just one small point I want to end before I finish. That government did make a very honest effort in directing subsidies, say in the case of gas cylinders, the cooking gas. It was a good scheme that 6 cylinders, of course people who are little better off are consuming more. So this is an indirect way of directing subsidies to the needy people. Unfortunately, even that good step for directing subsidy is sought to be undone by increasing the number from 6 to 9, or the state government saying that we are going to add 3 cylinders. How does it matter whether you are subsidizing from the one pocket or the other pocket? So I think we need to focus more on this aspect of efficiency of subsidies and how they are better directed.
All right, so we'll have to take a quick break. We'll continue the discussion on the other side. But before we go, in fact, let's also listen in to the former RBI Governor Bimal Jalan, who we spoke to earlier in the morning.
The whole thinking within the government is definitely on the side of fiscal consolidation, on the side of reviving investment, on the side of lowering inflation. All those are well known, so I need not go into that. It's a question of how to get it done, because the problem is complex. I mean, it's not easy. Announcements are easy, but doing it actually in practice on the ground is much more difficult in our political environment. It's a difficult issue, so let's not minimize the problem that the government faces, but the determination there now certainly is evident that they are going to do something worthwhile to reduce policy impediments to growth, policy impediments to fiscal correction. But how the policy actually works out on the ground is for us to wait and see. Now, there is no problem if you are reducing expenditure and correcting your fiscal deficit on what you call the current account. I mean, as it were. Current account, that is current expenditure, administrative expenditure, diversion of resources, 48% of PDS expenditure is diverted, public distribution system below the poverty line. So the concentration has to be in minimizing this kind of revenue expenditure, revenue deficit. But so far as public investment is concerned, so far as building roads is concerned, transport is concerned, power is concerned, we have to take measure to ensure that the kind of targets that we set are actually fulfilled and capital expenditure doesn't decline. That is the most important issue in tackling fiscal deficit, is then that we should not sacrifice capital expenditure or public investment in crucial areas for development of our country. So far as measures are concerned, we have taken some of the right measures in trying to reduce the scope of revenue expenditure or scope of subsidies. But the more important point to my mind is to try and make sure that the diversion of our public resources to wasteful expenditure, to corruption, to other areas which don't add either to investment or to consumer relief at the below the poverty line is done. I mean, you just look at Planning Commission study, which says 48% of the subsidy that you are providing for below poverty line persons in distributing food is actually diverted. This is not your assessment or my assessment or somebody else's assessment. So, I mean, what do you do? And we have started a cash transfer scheme, and I hope that would work. And measures we have to concentrate on, that India has all the resources, all the abilities, all the technical competence to do what it wants to do. But you know, at the governmental level, there is a tremendous complexity, fractious politics, and we can talk about it if you have time. And in implementation, there is no accountability. Who is responsible? I think that we should start slowly. We should do what we can. We should make sure that implementation is there. But more important than everything else is, if I set a target of expenditure, capital expenditure, somebody has to be accountable, somebody has to be responsible, and it has to be realistic. And I have no doubt that when you see this year's budget, as has been the case, I have been involved in all this for a very long time, that we all used to do this, that you find that we announce something by way of capital expenditure, investment, subsidy, welfare, poverty alleviation, and so on and so forth. It's not fulfilled. Who is accountable? And you know, again, I think accountability of ministers who decide.
Welcome back. You're with We Mean Business, and we're debating the FM's austerity drive to hit the tough fiscal targets by March. I want to come to, in fact, Mr. Ashok Kumar Jha. So you heard what Mr. Vasudev said in the last segment about targeting only the wasteful side of the subsidy regime and not actually hitting capital expenditure. Give us a sense of what sort of expenditure cuts you would want to see, because the talk now is really about credible fiscal consolidation and not just fiscal consolidation. What really are some of the target areas that the government should be targeting?
See, as I said earlier, I don't think the government is targeting any particular department as far as expenditure is concerned. The target every year, and I repeat every year, it's not new this year, is that at the end of December, the government reviews the expenditure of all departments and comes to a conclusion whether a particular department is going to be able to spend the money allocated to it in the budget. If it feels that a particular department, let's say, has only spent 20% in the first 9 months of the financial year, then quite obviously it's going to be quite incapable of spending the balance 80%. So it imposes a cut. The cut can be 5%, 10%. I believe this year it has gone up to even 25% in the case of some departments. So it is not as though this year there is a concerted drive to slash expenditure as is being made out. The only difference I suspect this year that's going to be is that earlier years, whatever savings was surrendered by a particular department used to be reappropriated to another department. Some departments which felt that they needed more money during the year. This year I suspect that the government will not allow the reappropriation. They might just resume the savings, and therefore there will be an effective cut. So it is not as though the government is directing the cut to any particular department. That's the point that I wanted to make. As far as whether we should cut subsidies, wasteful subsidies, etc. I mean, it's a foregone conclusion that you must cut subsidies which are wasteful, which are not directed properly. So I don't think anybody can debate this issue. The question really is ultimately, how much money do we have to spend? See, we spent our way out of the global financial crisis by increasing our fiscal deficit from around 2.5% of GDP to almost 6%, 6.5% of GDP.
I just wanted to.
So we have to now bring the.
So I just want to interrupt you on this whole issue, wasteful expenditure. Different people clearly have different interpretations on what really is wasteful, because like Mr. Vasudev said about what really happened with the LPG gas cap. And Nalin Kohli, I want to bring you in. Every time the government tries to do something on the subsidy front, the opposition is up in arms. What do you really think is wasteful? What do you really think the government should be targeting? Tomorrow they might go ahead and do the same thing again, bring back the cap to 6, and then the opposition would say that's not fair, that's not happening.
Well, I think everything is on a context, Nikhil, and the mistake is that when you try to look at it in a very unipolar way. So you would say that the BJP is opposing this. So let's start one by one. There's often this misconception that the BJP is opposing GST. The question here is that states and the non-Congress states have had a reason to feel that they are not taken, the government has a discriminatory attitude to them. You have to get the states on board. Now that the government is talking to the states, there seems to be some movement ahead. Otherwise, the Select Committee of Parliament had already given the recommendations to the government, and it's a constitutional change. So it's a process, and the onus of getting the process through is on the government. The BJP on its part has supported the government on certain bills, and that's on the record. Let's now get down to subsidies. What our point has been throughout, the first question to be asked is, why are we in this situation? If there has been a mismanagement of the economic situation, it wasn't bad in 2004 when we demitted office. The FRBM was in place. The Electricity Act was in place. These were legislations that were brought in to basically consolidate and streamline the economic system. Now, if you have gone beyond that, there has to be some kind of accountability. What we are talking, so therefore, when you have price rise, which is very high, when you have food inflation, sometimes in real terms 20 to 25%, and you then suddenly remove the subsidy from diesel, you're only boosting it further. Then on the other hand, you say, let us give a subsidy in terms of food. So I mean, you have to have an approach that brings a sense of balance. The second point I want to flag in here is about taxation, which came up a little earlier. The idea is to expand the tax base. Now we haven't moved significantly in that area. So therefore, I mean, are you going to punish the existing taxpayers, or are you going to widen the base? So that's what basically in the realm of government. The third thing related to that is, as Mr. Yashwant Sinha in an interview has pointed out recently, we are talking of an inheritance tax. Now sometimes reality is the person who's inheriting a property does not have the wherewithal to actually pay the tax, so he might as well sell off the property, because you might have a house which is very expensive, left by the father for the son, and the son might just not be, or the daughter might not have any kind of revenue to pay tax. So you have to look at it holistically. The last point is about wasteful expenditure. What is wasteful is if you are not taking the subsidy to the person where it matters. Now let's take the example of PDS in Chhattisgarh. It has been found to work. I mean, those who need it are being able to access it. On the other hand, what you are talking about, say the cooking gas, it's an example, but let's take down what I raised earlier, the question of farmer subsidies. Now farm subsidy exists even in the developed world, because agriculture is an important component of the economy. You can't wipe out food security, and in India it's extremely important. What Shoma raised a point earlier, and I want to flag that too. You have to make the economy basically self-generating in jobs. So there are many ways of looking at creating jobs or strengthening those traditional ways that people don't lose those crafts which are self-employed. You can't drive everybody to a job, because ultimately you can't create a job for everybody. Now, my final point is about the loan waiver scheme for farmers. Now, when the reports are coming out that it was basically a scam, people pocketed the money, the real farmer who required it didn't get it. So, when you cut down those inefficiencies, you are saving wasteful expenditure. Last point, unfortunately, and this is reality, Government of India ministries tend to look at their importance based on the financial allocation, not the work they are doing. So, I mean, if you have a large budgetary outlay, 10,000, 15, 20, 30, 50, 100,000 crores, you are an important ministry. Whereas a ministry like Science and Technology may not have, or Culture may not have such a large budget, but they are nonetheless expensive. So, the focus has to be on work and achievement, not just spending money.
I just want to take that to Shoma. So, do you think we need then a meritocratic sort of approach to cutting expenditure? You know, probably ministries who've done well, you can incentivize them with a bit more money. Those that haven't, or those that probably take a back seat in terms of priority, should be given a little less instead of a 10-20% blanket sort of cut.
Yeah, it should be meritorious, but I don't know whether it's about, you know, if a ministry has behaved badly that you cut their money. Maybe it's a very important ministry that should be behaving better. And so what you really want is more accountability, you know. I think what you really need across the board is just implementation and governance, for Christ's sake, you know. I mean, what is this country? We just can't seem to have implementation on anything, you know. And you look at it, whether it's the irrigation scam in Maharashtra, or it's the National Rural Health Scheme in UP, or any of this, you know, what it really boils down to, I think there's enough money in this country to do a lot that we really need to do. But all of it, I think everyone, when you really scratch beneath the surface, what everyone is talking about now is implementation and governance, you know. So it really is about accountability. I don't think it's a formula that, you know, a particular ministry has behaved badly. I just gave you an example of the craft, you know, the fact that it's a 400 billion market and that we barely own 2% of that market, though we are so rich in crafts. I'll give you another figure. You know, the tourism industry worldwide is such a mammoth industry, but India typically gets about 4 million people coming in. Something like, you know, a small country like Switzerland or Sweden would get 40 million people coming in every year, you know. So that's the kind of lack of focus and lack of broad-based thinking. I think we're too glamored with only one kind of growth. And so when you're talking about ministries and expenditure cuts, I think it just has to be back to basics. You know, focus, goals, vision, some game plan. Let me give you another example. Minerals, you know, the use of natural resources, which has been the basis of all scams over the past couple of years. Let me tell you, when the Ashok Chawla committee was set up, Mr. Chawla said that this country does not even possess a map of the resources that we have, of the mineral resources.
I think,
so, you know, you're
Shoma,
giving out,
a lot of what you're talking could be medium-term objectives. You know, as we start wrapping up, Mr. Vasudev, the immediate solutions, should the FM be looking at things like land monetization, for instance, rather than going in for a deep cut in spending at a time when really it's not looking pretty at all from an economic standpoint. Land monetization, what Shoma said about incentivizing other sectors such as tourism, where we really haven't done anything.
Land monetization is a good idea, but I think it really needs to be thought through, and I don't think it has reached a stage where government can straight away start taking a decision about monetizing excess public land, whether it is with government departments or railways or defense or various PSUs. It is an interesting idea, but I think it still needs to be thought through. But I just want to make one final observation. I think unfortunately in our system, the government's growth aspirations are linked with the size of the planned expenditure that they are going to make. So if the government gives more money for gross budgetary support, it is supposed to be a growth-oriented budget. Right. If different ministries ask for more planned resources, they are supposed to be more growth-oriented. Right. Yeah. You know, unfortunately, in our system, the focus is more on expenditure type of monitoring rather than outcome-based. Right. I think that if the finance minister can try to focus the expenditure on a little bit on the quality of expenditure and more outcome-based, and reducing the inefficiencies and the non-productive type of expenditures, that may be perhaps the way to go.
Right, we're completely out of time, but just one last word to you, Mr. Joshi. Given what we've discussed, how do you think the budget is going to look like? Are you expecting a double whammy of sorts of higher taxes and lower spending, or do you think the finance minister is going to be prudent and won't go that far? Just 30 seconds.
Well, I think there has, I mean, he's going to target 4.8% fiscal deficit. For that, I think he needs to rein in expenditure, and I think he'll also look at some new sources of revenue. What that will be, it's difficult for me to say right now.
All right, on that note, we'll have to wrap up this discussion. Clearly, the finance minister finds himself with the onerous and unenviable task of balancing several different metrics. How he'll make this a budget that's both politically and economically palatable would indeed be very interesting to watch. A big thank you to all our guests, and thanks very much indeed for watching We Mean Business.